Russia has turned to its elite paratroopers, the VDV Airborne Forces, to help defend against Ukraine's battlefield advances. War analysts say these troops, repurposed as a kind of regular infantry, reeling from past setbacks and failures, and battered and bruised from combat, might now be airborne in name only. The VDV, the Airborne Forces of the Russian military, is one of several bands of so-called elite troops who have been misused or retasked to irregular purposes throughout Moscow's 19-month-long war in Ukraine. These paratroopers have suffered heavy casualties during combat and were recently called up to defend as Kyiv's forces continue making territorial gains in their counteroffensive. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said this week that there are several actions being taken to increase the combat potential of the VDV, such as the creation of new airborne assault units. Additionally, Moscow is adding support, repair, recovery, and artillery capabilities to all divisions of the VDV, as well as new weapons and equipment, Shoigu told a session of Russia's Defense Ministry Board. He claimed these initiatives will ultimately boost the paratroopers' fighting and firepower potential. Analysts at the Institute for the Study of War (ISW), a Washington-based think tank, said in response to Shoigu's announcement that these efforts will bring the VDV into closer alignment with the force composition of a standard Russian motorized rifle division, or infantry units that are supported by armored combat vehicles. These additional units will likely allow the Russian military to use Russian VDV divisions almost interchangeably with motorized rifle divisions in the future, and VDV elements in Ukraine have been increasingly operating as combat infantry similar to motorized rifle divisions, the ISW analysts wrote in a Tuesday assessment of the ongoing war. The Russian MOD's provision of additional elements to Russian VDV units and formations serving in Ukraine is a recognition of the role Russian VDV forces are currently playing in Ukraine and highlights the non-standard way in which the Russian military is using these forces, the analysts wrote. These Russian formations have become airborne in name only, and it is not clear when the Russian MOD intends for them to take to the skies again. VDV forces were heavily utilized during operations at the start of the war but not always properly, at times leading the paratroopers to endure steep casualties, which only continued in the following months. Call. General Mikhail Teplinsky, commander of the VDV, revealed earlier in August that at least 8,500 paratroopers had been wounded in combat. That figure, however, only referred to troops who were injured and refused to leave the battlefield or those who left and returned to the front lines. He did not share the number of soldiers who never returned to the fight or how many died after succumbing to their injuries. Several days later, Britain's Defense Ministry wrote in an intelligence update that at least half of the 30,000 paratroopers who were sent to Ukraine had been injured or killed. As so-called elite Russian forces have taken losses, they have at times been backfilled with poorly trained replacements, degrading the overall capability of the unit. Since those figures were released, VDV units have been transferred to support Moscow's defensive efforts in the face of Ukraine's pressing counteroffensive. Paratroopers were deployed from the Kherson and Luhansk regions to the Zaporizhia region in the south and the war-torn city of Bakhmut in the east, two directions where Kyiv's forces have been advancing. ISW experts said at the time that Russia's dependence on the VDV in both an offensive and defensive role has likely been detrimental to the paratroopers, though it is unclear how many casualties the VDV has suffered in its new role. The VDV is one of several elite units to suffer severe casualties during the war as Moscow has relied heavily on them. Such was the case with the 200th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade and the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade, both of which have been battered in combat. The paratroopers are also an example of Russia's misuse of elite soldiers sent on missions they weren't designed for. Other misused forces include the Spetsnaz commandos, who, for example, were assigned reconnaissance roles with conventional forces instead of partaking in the early assaults on Kyiv. Ukraine's counterattacking forces are still edging forwards on the southern Zaporizhia front, hoping to exploit gaps wrought in Russian defensive lines to achieve a significant breakthrough towards the strategic target of Bakhmut, prompting Moscow to deploy reinforcements. Recent Ukrainian gains around the Zaporizhia settlement of Verbov have raised hopes that the long-awaited breakthrough may soon materialize, after more than 3 months of a slow and costly push towards Russia's so-called Surovikin line of fortifications stretching across occupied southern Ukraine. The Institute for the Study of War (ISW) reported on Tuesday that the tactical situation in Verbove remains unclear as Ukrainian forces continued offensive operations in the area. Newsweek has contacted the Russian Defense Ministry by email to request comment. The think tank cited reports among Russian Telegram millbloggers suggesting that Kyiv's troops had reached the northern outskirts of Novoprokopivka, around 8 miles south of Oriki, the town from which Ukraine's southern drive began in June. Meanwhile, Ukrainian infantry and armored units are still thought to be pushing into the bulge developing in Russian defensive lines in Verbove, 11 miles southeast of Oriki, where recent battlefield reports indicate significant Russian losses and the possibility of a sustained Ukrainian breakthrough. The regional strategic prize is the town of Bakhmut, around 12 miles from the current front line and serving as a key railway, command, and logistics hub for defending Russian forces. The town is ringed with newly built defensive networks in preparation for a possible Ukrainian breakthrough to the north. The ISW suggested that Russian reinforcements are being rushed to the Bakhmut area as Ukrainian forces gain ground. Among the units thought to be in the area are elements of the 42nd Motorized Rifle Division, the 71st Motorized Rifle Regiment, and the 70th Motorized Rifle Regiment. The ISW said the deployment of such groups as far back as Bakhmut itself suggests that the Russian command has not manned the multi-echelon defense in southern Ukraine in depth. Most Russian forces in the area, the bulletin said, appear to be deployed to immediate frontline areas. The deployment of the 70th and 71st Motorized Rifle Regiments as far back as Bakhmut suggests that elements of the same Russian formations and units defending at forward positions or holding positions, likely in smaller numbers, in subsequent defensive layers, ISW wrote. It is possible that unobserved elements of other Russian units and formations hold positions at rear defensive positions, although the current Russian manpower commitment to holding positions on the front line indicates that this is unlikely. The General Staff of Ukraine's Armed Forces reported on September 27 that Russia lost 276,990 troops in Ukraine since the beginning of its full-scale invasion on February 24 last year. This number includes 320 casualties Russian forces suffered just over the past day, the General Staff said.